There comes a moment when silence stops being a reaction and becomes a decision. And that is where the entire dynamic begins to change. A super empath can spend a long time trying to explain what they feel, trying to make the avoidant understand the pain behind their words, trying to repair every misunderstanding, and trying to keep the connection alive even when the other person keeps creating distance. But eventually, something shifts. They stop explaining, they stop chasing, they stop asking, "Why are you doing this?" And they simply become quiet. That silence can be far more powerful than an argument because an argument still gives the other person access to your emotions. When you argue, you are showing them that they can still pull you into the cycle. When you keep sending messages, you're showing them that distance still has the power to make you reach for them. But when you become calm, when you stop reacting, when you stop trying to convince someone of your value, the entire emotional pattern begins to lose its strength. This is not about playing games. It is not about giving someone the silent treatment to punish them. It is about reaching a point where you realize that you should not have to repeatedly explain your worth to someone who has already had countless opportunities to recognize it. And that realization can be unsettling for an avoidant person because sometimes the avoidant is comfortable with a predictable pattern. They pull away, the other person follows. They become distant. The other person asks questions. They become cold. The other person becomes more emotionally available. The cycle creates a strange sense of control. But when the super empath stops participating, the pattern suddenly has nowhere to go. There is no emotional argument to win, no message to ignore, no desperate explanation to dismiss, no reaction to use as proof that they still have emotional influence. And that is when silence starts speaking louder than words. The avoidant may begin wondering what changed. Why aren't they reaching out anymore? Why aren't they asking for answers? Why don't they seem as affected? Did they finally move on? Did they realize something? Did someone else enter their life? These questions can become louder precisely because there are no answers being handed to them. But the most important transformation isn't what happens inside the avoidant. It's what happens inside the super empath. The super empath begins to discover that peace feels different from chasing. They realize how exhausting it was to constantly monitor another person's mood, waiting for a message, analyzing every word, wondering whether distance meant rejection or whether closeness would return. And once they step outside that emotional maze, they begin to see the relationship from a completely different perspective. They don't need to prove that they are hurt. They don't need to demonstrate how much they cared. They don't need to make the avoidant jealous. They don't need revenge. They simply stop abandoning themselves to keep someone else close. And that is a powerful form of emotional independence. Because when your silence comes from healing rather than manipulation, it carries a completely different energy. You are no longer silent because you want someone to chase you. You are silent because you finally understand that your peace deserves protection. And once that happens, the entire dynamic begins to change. Sometimes the loudest message you can send is the one you no longer feel the need to say. There is another moment when the dynamic begins to change, and it happens when you stop reacting to the push and pull. Because for a long time, the avoidant may have learned that distance creates a predictable response. They pull closer, then suddenly become cold. They give attention, then disappear. They open the door emotionally, then close it without warning. And every time that happens, the super empath feels a shift and instinctively wants to understand it, fix it, or restore the connection. But eventually, something changes. You stop chasing the explanation. You stop asking why their energy changed overnight. You stop sending another message because they haven't answered the first one. You stop trying to decode every change in their behavior. And most importantly, you stop allowing someone else's inconsistency to determine your emotional state. That is when the push and pull pattern starts losing its power. An avoidant may be accustomed to creating distance and seeing the other person move closer, not necessarily because they are consciously trying to manipulate anyone, but because emotional distance can become a familiar way of protecting themselves. When closeness feels overwhelming, they retreat. When the other person responds by pursuing harder, the avoidant gets even more space. Then, when the pressure disappears, they may feel safe enough to come closer again. And the cycle repeats. But a super empath who has become emotionally grounded begins responding differently. Instead of running toward every moment of distance, they pause. Instead of assuming that silence means they need to work harder, they allow silence to exist. Instead of treating every withdrawal like an emergency, they recognize it as information. That doesn't mean they become cold. It means they become conscious. There is a huge difference between caring about someone and allowing their behavior to control you. You can love someone and still refuse to chase them. You can understand someone's emotional defenses without becoming responsible for managing them. You can have compassion for why someone withdraws without sacrificing your own emotional stability every time they do. And that distinction is where the super empath becomes powerful, because the avoidant can no longer predict the reaction. The old pattern says, if I pull away, they will come closer. But the new pattern says, if you pull away, I will respect your space and I will continue living my life. That response can create a completely different emotional experience for the avoidant. Suddenly, distance no longer guarantees attention. Withdrawal no longer guarantees pursuit. Silence no longer automatically produces another emotional conversation. And that can force the avoidant to confront something they may have been avoiding within themselves. What happens when the person they expected to chase them simply doesn't? What happens when the emotional safety net they took for granted is no longer constantly available? What happens when the other person isn't angry, isn't begging, isn't demanding, but simply calm? That calmness can be more confronting than conflict. Because conflict gives you something to fight against. Calmness gives you nothing to fight. And this is where the super empath must be careful. The goal isn't to create anxiety in the avoidant or to use emotional withdrawal as a weapon. The goal is to break your own dependence on the cycle. If they come closer, you don't lose yourself. If they move away, you don't collapse. Your emotional center remains yours. That is real strength. You are no longer reacting from fear of losing them. You are responding from an understanding of your own value. And when you stop reacting to the push and pull, you don't just change the relationship, you change the person you become inside it. You stop chasing emotional certainty from someone who can only offer emotional confusion, and you start choosing the peace that comes from standing firmly in your own power. There comes a point where emotional strength is no longer about understanding someone else's behavior. It becomes about understanding what you will and will not allow into your own life. And this is where the super empath begins to become difficult to manipulate, not because they become cold, but because they become aware. For a long time, a deeply empathetic person may give people the benefit of the doubt. They see the fear behind someone's distance. They understand why someone might shut down, become defensive, disappear, or send mixed signals. They can look beyond the behavior, recognize the wound underneath it. But empathy without boundaries can become exhausting, because when you understand everyone else's pain, you can sometimes start making excuses for behavior that continues to hurt you. You tell yourself, maybe they are afraid, maybe they need space, maybe if I am more patient, they will finally open up. And patience can be beautiful, understanding can be powerful, but there is a difference between understanding someone's behavior and accepting behavior that repeatedly damages your peace. That is where the super empath begins to change. They stop asking, how can I make this person comfortable? And start asking, is this relationship healthy for me? That single question can completely transform the dynamic, because manipulation becomes much harder when someone no longer feels obligated to prove their loyalty. If guilt appears, they don't immediately surrender. If mixed signals appear, they don't spend hours trying to decode them. If someone suddenly becomes affectionate after being distant, they don't automatically forget everything that happened before. They observe, they pause, they choose. And that ability to pause is incredibly powerful. The avoidant may have been accustomed to emotional reactions. Maybe the other person will become anxious, angry, overly available, or desperate for reassurance. But when the super empath becomes grounded, those reactions begin to disappear. They don't need to punish anyone. They don't need to expose anyone. They don't need to expose anyone. They simply refuse to be pulled into emotional confusion. And that can be deeply uncomfortable for someone who has relied on emotional distance to maintain control over a relationship. Because boundaries change the rules. A boundary says, I understand why you need space, but I won't chase you. A boundary says, I care about you, but I won't accept disrespect. A boundary says, you are allowed to make your choices, and I am allowed to make mine. Notice how different that is from manipulation. Manipulation tries to control another person's behavior. A boundary controls your own participation. That is why true emotional independence doesn't require anger. You don't have to become bitter to become strong. You don't have to hate someone to stop allowing them access to parts of you that they repeatedly mishandle. Sometimes strength looks incredibly quiet. It looks like not responding immediately. It looks like walking away from an argument that is going nowhere. It looks like refusing to explain yourself for the 10th time. It looks like recognizing that someone else's emotional discomfort is not automatically your responsibility. And perhaps the most important change is this: the super empath stops confusing compassion with self sacrifice. You can understand someone without rescuing them. You can love someone without fixing them. You can forgive someone without giving them unlimited access to you. And you can recognize someone's wounds without allowing those wounds to become weapons against your own peace. When that happens, the emotional leverage begins to disappear. The avoidant can no longer create confusion and expect you to chase clarity. They can no longer create distance and assume you will abandon your boundaries to restore closeness. They can no longer rely on your empathy as an endless source of forgiveness without accountability. And that is not about destroying anyone's ego. It is about rebuilding your own sense of self. Because the moment you become emotionally unavailable to manipulation, you become emotionally available to yourself. And that is where real freedom begins. There is a moment when the greatest change doesn't happen because you say something powerful. It happens because you simply keep moving forward. You stop waiting for someone to come back. You stop putting your life on pause. You start investing your energy into yourself, your goals, your confidence, your peace, and the future you once neglected while trying to understand someone else's behavior. And that is when the dynamic can change in a way the avoidant never expected. Because when someone has become accustomed to being the center of your emotional attention, your progress can feel louder than any confrontation. Not because you were trying to make them jealous, not because you were trying to prove that you have moved on, but because your life is genuinely moving forward without requiring their participation. Think about what happens when you stop checking your phone every few minutes. You stop wondering whether they will message. You stop analyzing their social media activity. You stop asking mutual friends what they are doing. You stop creating imaginary conversations in your head about what you should have said. Your attention comes back to you, and that is a powerful transition. The energy that was once spent trying to understand the avoidant becomes energy you can use to build something real. You begin focusing on your work. You take care of your appearance. You reconnect with friends. You pursue goals that you had pushed aside. You become more present in your own life, and slowly something changes inside you. You realize that the world did not stop because someone walked away. In fact, you may discover that you were holding yourself back while waiting for someone else to decide what they wanted. This is where the super empath becomes especially difficult to pull back into the old cycle. Because when your life becomes fulfilling on its own, emotional uncertainty loses some of its power. You no longer need someone else's attention to feel valuable. You no longer need their approval to feel attractive. You no longer need their return to feel complete. And if they come back, you can actually ask a different question. Not, do they still want me? But does what they're offering fit the life I have built? That is a completely different position. The avoidant may notice the difference too. Perhaps they expected you to remain emotionally available. Perhaps they assumed you would still be waiting. But now there is a version of you they didn't anticipate. Someone who is calm, busy, confident, and no longer organizing their life around the relationship. And sometimes that realization can challenge an ego more deeply than anger ever could. Because anger still says, you matter enough to control my emotions. But genuine progress says, you are no longer controlling the direction of my life. That is the difference. However, moving forward doesn't mean pretending you never cared. It doesn't mean erasing the memories or becoming emotionally numb. It means refusing to let the past dictate your future. You can remember someone and still move forward. You can miss someone and still choose yourself. You can care about someone and still recognize that the relationship may not be healthy for you. That is emotional maturity. And the most powerful part is that you don't have to announce any of it. You don't need a dramatic post. You don't need a carefully designed message. You don't need to show them how happy you are. You simply live. You let your actions become the evidence. And eventually you may reach a point where the reaction doesn't even matter anymore. Whether they notice your growth or never notice it, you continue. Whether they return or remain distant, you continue. Whether they understand your transformation or completely misunderstand it, you continue. Because the real victory was never making someone regret losing you. The real victory was becoming someone who no longer feels lost because they did. And once your life starts moving forward without them, you discover that your future was never waiting for their permission. And then you reach the deepest shift of all, the moment when you no longer need their validation to know who you are. Because for a super empath, this can be one of the hardest lessons to learn. When you care deeply, you can become deeply invested in how the other person sees you. You want them to understand your intentions. You want them to recognize your loyalty. You want them to acknowledge the effort you made, the patience you showed, and the love you gave. And when they don't, it can feel like something inside you is missing. You start wondering, was I not enough? Why couldn't they choose me? What did I do wrong? Why could they give someone else what they couldn't give me? But eventually, the super empath realizes that another person's inability to validate your value does not reduce your value. That realization changes everything. Because when you stop needing the avoidant to choose you, the emotional leverage disappears. Their approval is no longer the prize. Their attention is no longer the measurement of your worth. Their return is no longer proof that you are lovable. You begin to understand that validation feels good, but dependence on validation is where the suffering begins. And this is why the strongest transformation doesn't happen when the avoidant finally comes back. It happens when they could come back, and you would still ask whether their behavior deserves access to you. That is a completely different mindset. Before, you might have thought if they return, everything will finally be okay. Now you think, if they return, what has actually changed? Before, their message could instantly change your entire mood. Now you can read the message without losing your emotional center. Before, distance made you question yourself. Now, distance simply gives you information. Before, you needed them to explain why they couldn't love you the way you needed. Now, you understand that sometimes you don't need another explanation. You need acceptance. And acceptance is not giving up. It is recognizing reality without allowing reality to destroy your self-respect. This is where the super empath becomes emotionally free. They stop trying to convince someone to see their worth. They stop performing for love. They stop over-giving in the hope that eventually the other person will realize what they have. They stop shrinking their needs so someone else can remain comfortable. And most importantly, they stop negotiating against themselves. That doesn't mean they stop loving. It means their love now has boundaries. They can care without chasing. They can forgive without forgetting. They can remain compassionate without becoming emotionally available to every inconsistency. And if the avoidant notices this change, they may feel the difference immediately. The person who once needed reassurance now has their own certainty. The person who once waited for a response now has a life to return to. The person who once measured their worth through another person's attention now measures it through the standards they have created for themselves. And that can be deeply confronting, because when you no longer need someone, you finally have the freedom to choose them or not choose them from a place of strength rather than fear. That is the real end of the cycle. Not revenge, not punishment, not making someone jealous, not destroying their ego. It is simply refusing to destroy yourself to maintain a connection. And perhaps that is the most powerful lesson of all. Your worth was never something another person had the authority to give you, and it was never something they had the power to take away. When you finally stop seeking validation outside yourself, you stop chasing the person who made you question your value, and you start becoming the person who never questions it again. And after all of this, there's one final transformation that reveals whether you have truly broken free from the old emotional cycle. You no longer need closure from the person who created the confusion. For a super empath, closure can feel incredibly important. You want the conversation that never happened. You want the explanation that was never given. You want to know why someone suddenly changed, why they pulled away, why they made you feel close and then created distance. You replay conversations in your mind, searching for the exact moment when everything changed. But eventually, you realize something difficult. Sometimes the answer you are waiting for will never come from the person you are waiting for. And when you understand that, something inside you becomes quiet. You stop believing that one final conversation will magically repair everything. You stop imagining that if they could just explain themselves properly, the pain would disappear. You stop waiting for the perfect apology, the perfect message, or the perfect moment when they finally admit what they did. Because closure doesn't always come from someone else understanding your pain. Sometimes closure comes from you understanding your own limits. You begin looking at the pattern instead of the promise. You stop focusing only on the moments when they were loving and start considering the entire experience. You ask yourself how consistently you felt respected, secure, valued, and emotionally safe. And suddenly the question changes. Instead of asking, "Why did they do this to me?" you begin asking, "Why did I keep accepting something that was hurting me?" That question isn't meant to create shame. It is meant to create awareness. Because the moment you take responsibility for your own participation in the cycle, you also take back your power to leave it. You realize that you cannot force someone to communicate. You cannot force someone to become emotionally available. You cannot love someone into readiness. You cannot make another person confront wounds they are unwilling to face. And once you accept that, you stop carrying responsibilities that were never yours. The avoidant may still have their fears. They may still struggle with intimacy. They may still experience the urge to create distance when emotions become intense. But those struggles no longer have to become your identity. You don't have to follow them into every emotional storm. You don't have to become their therapist. You don't have to prove that you are safe enough to love. You simply allow their choices to belong to them, and your choices belong to you. This is where the entire dynamic reaches its final stage. The silence from the beginning is no longer silence filled with hope that they will return. The boundaries are no longer designed to make them react. Your progress is no longer something you secretly hope they notice. And your lack of need for validation is no longer an act. It has become who you are. That is when the old emotional leverage truly disappears. If they return, you don't immediately surrender yourself. If they disappear, you don't immediately blame yourself. If they reach out, you listen without abandoning your standards. If they remain silent, you continue living. And that is what emotional freedom looks like. Not becoming heartless, not pretending you never cared, not trying to destroy another person's ego, but reaching a place where another person's choices can no longer destroy your sense of self. Because the strongest person in the room isn't always the one who speaks the loudest or walks away dramatically. Sometimes it is the person who finally understands that peace is more valuable than proving a point. And when you reach that place, you don't need to destroy anyone's ego anymore. You simply stop allowing the behavior to control your life.